Thanks for showing up. I think some of you had to show up. Okay. This talk, so as Santiago was saying, I'm really a philosopher of cognitive science. That's how I approach a lot of the topics that I engage in. This talk is about consciousness, more about philosophy of mind, but you'll see how these things are sort of overlapping in how I'm approaching things. So the talk is going to be on the subject of the unity of consciousness. Some of you might already have a sense as to what that is. Before I tell you what I'm going to argue for, a quick way of grasping what people have in mind when they talk about the unity of consciousness is to think about your experience at this moment. You have visual experiences, maybe of me, maybe of the screen, maybe of whatever you're looking at. You have auditory experiences of me speaking. You might have some sort of like tactile experience, the sort of chair, or maybe, it's a little cold in here, so on and so on, right? There's a way in which all of these aspects of your experience at this moment are presented to you in a unified way. They're presented to you as a package, as part of your overall experience. Okay? That's, in a basic form, what's meant by the unity of consciousness, that sort of unity to the experience. And I'll say a lot more about what the unity of consciousness is supposed to be as we move along. But what I'm going to argue for here is I'm going to try and provide either what you might call a reductive analysis of the unity of consciousness, or I prefer to call it a deflationary analysis of the unity of consciousness. So this thing, the unity of consciousness, that has puzzled all these philosophers and scientists of consciousness, I'm going to propose is nothing more than a feature of how we experience our mental lives unfolding in time. Okay. So once you have an analysis of how we come to experience our mental events as being temporally structured, we get, as a result of that, an account of the unity of consciousness. Okay. That's the sense in which it's kind of reductive, but it's also deflationary. There's nothing more to unity than that. So the way that the talk is going to be structured is the first two sections, I'm going to do a bit more work to try and specify what's meant by the unity of consciousness. What is it? What is this thing that we're trying to study and understand? Then in the third section, I'm going to give my proposal. And then in the fourth and fifth sections, I'm going to deal with an objection and try and show how this proposed analysis of the unity of consciousness I provide is something that isn't a deep mystery, but rather it's an analysis in terms of something that we can study using the standard tools of cognitive science. Okay. So, it's kind of an unfortunate fact about research or theorizing about consciousness that you can't specify the thing that you're trying to analyze with any clear-cut definition or a clear operationalization or anything like that that gives you a firm footing. Instead, theorizing always starts with something like a description or a vignette, right? Theorists will describe something that sort of points towards the phenomena, and then you study whatever that thing is. Right? Research on the unity of consciousness is no different. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few quotes here. There's a few quotes at the beginning of the talk, and then after a few minutes, there won't be any quotes, right? But the first few minutes are very quote heavy. Okay, so here's Tim Bain in what might be called like a now classic characterization of the unity of consciousness. He says, a person's simultaneous conscious states are typically contained within an overall phenomenal perspective or field. My experiences of hearing the music of Mingus, seeing the words on a computer monitor, and tasting olives do not occur in isolation from each other, but occur together as components as a phenomenal whole. So put yourself into Tim Bain's position there. There's a way in which all of these different components are presented to him together, right? It's this togetherness that's the unity of consciousness. Here's a similar quote from Brooke and Raymond in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They say, human consciousness usually displays a striking unity. When one experiences a noise and, say, a pain, one is not conscious of the noise and then separately of the pain. Instead, one is conscious of the noise and pain together as aspects of a single conscious experience. And here's one more quote. It's a longer one from Bain and Chalmers. Okay. They say, at any given moment, a subject has a multiplicity of conscious experiences. A subject might simultaneously have visual experiences of a red book and a green tree, auditory experiences of birds singing, bodily sensations of a faint hunger and a sharp pain in the shoulder, the emotional experience of a certain melancholy, all while having a stream of conscious thoughts about the nature of reality. These experiences are distinct from each other. A subject could experience the red book without the singing birds and could experience the red book. It could experience the singing birds without the red book. But at the same time, the experiences seem to be tied together in a deep way. They seem to be unified by being aspects of a single encompassing state of consciousness. All of these quotes are gesturing towards the same sort of thing. At any given moment, we have a complex phenomenal experience. It has different sorts of components. These components seem like they could be had independently of one another, right? My voice could be very different than it is right now. You know, that could come apart from the other things that you're experiencing, right? But there seems to be something over and above those individual components that unifies them, right? There's this way in which they're presented to you together, right? Now, this is pretty much the full extent that you normally see in the literature is trying to gesture towards our phenomena of interest, right? If you read these quotes and you get it, then you know what we're studying, right? But a lot of people read these quotes and don't quite get it. You kind of get a sense that there's something unified here, but it's not quite clear what it is. I'm one of these people too. There's something maybe trivially unifying about these experiences, but it's not clear what the big mystery is, right? We're not alone, okay? Here's Rob Van Gulik pressing this worry, okay? So Rob Van Gulik says, he's puzzled about this unity here. He's trying to understand it. He's trying to get a better grasp of it. So he asks, what then determines whether or not two experiences occur within one such phenomenal field or are phenomenally unified? As with the notion of being subsumed in a single conscious state, the notion of occurring within a single phenomenal field puts a real explanatory burden on the relevant sense of singularity. And here's where he sort of poses a challenge. Without some specific account of what makes it the case that two experiences occur within a single field or are unified, the notion of phenomenal unity is left undefined. We don't have a clear grasp on our explanandum, right? In some ways, Van Gulik's worry isn't really about definitions at all. It's just, if we don't have a clear answer as to what makes it the case that experiences are unified, it might just be that the thing that we thought we were studying disappears. It's not a real phenomena, right? We're mistaken in some way. We're under the guise of some sort of like tricky language, right? But really there's nothing there. So what you find in the literature then on the unity of consciousness are people who try and answer Van Gulik's worry, right? So you find these two different approaches to phenomenal unity. Some adopt this non-reductive accounts of phenomenal unity. So you see this in the work of people like Barry Dayton that say, look, what unifies conscious experience is just a primitive. It's unanalyzable. It's one of those deep mysteries of the world, right? If you go with that sort of approach, you haven't answered Van Gulik's worry. You haven't done any more to help those of us who don't quite grasp what this unity of consciousness is to understand what it is, right? No explanatory progress is really made there, right? Other accounts, so reductive accounts, try to explain this unity relation in terms of some other relationship that holds between conscious experiences. They try and give you an analysis of what that added component is to our experience that binds together our experiences. Okay. So ultimately what I'm going to do is I'm going to give something of a reductive account of the unity of consciousness. Okay. But still, at this point in our theorizing, just going off of those descriptions and those little vignettes, it's really unclear what an adequate theory of the unity of consciousness might look like, right? It seems like more is needed. So that's what we're going to do in this next section. Okay? what we're going to do is we're going to look at several proposed accounts of the unity of consciousness, see how they fail, and that's going to sort of point us in the direction of what an adequate theory or account of the unity of consciousness might look like. Those of you with a philosophy of science background, there's sort of like a Popperian methodology here of conjecture and refutation, right? We're conjecturing an analysis, showing how it fails, and moving on to another one. Okay. So all of these accounts are going to point to something that seems to be unified in experience, and then ask the question whether or not that can account for the phenomenal unity. So I'm going to go through 3 or 4, depending on how you count, analyses, right? Starting with very implausible and going to slightly more plausible ones. So here's a form of unity that we find in experience. It's what a number of authors have called object unity. If you're familiar with vision science from the 1980s, this is just object binding or feature binding from Anne Treisman. The idea is something like this. At any given moment, we often experience various different features in the world. So here's a color, it's green, it's rectangular, right? We don't just experience the green and rectangularness as sort of like floating independently. They're unified in that they're instantiated by a single object. So that's a form of unity that we find in experience, right? And you do find some researchers trying to analyze the unity of consciousness in terms of something like object unity. So maybe that could be an account. But it seems like there's a pretty straightforward reason for why object unity can't be an analysis of the overall unity of consciousness. And it has to do with the fact that at any given moment, your overall unified experience can encompass more than an individual object. Object unity doesn't tell us how those individual objects get bound together. It just tells us what binds these individual objects together, right? So there's something missing there, okay? So let's look to something else. Maybe it's not about the objects that we perceive, but it's something about the space in which those objects appear, right? So maybe we can analyze the unity of consciousness in terms of something about how we experience space. It's an interesting fact about almost all of our sensory modalities that they locate objects within a shared common space, right? So right now, most of your eyes are open. Vision is locating me at a particular location. But if you were to close your eyes and then I would start walking around the room, audition would continue to locate me within that shared common space, right? There's a common space to most of our exteroceptive sensory modalities, right? So maybe we can analyze the unity of consciousness in terms of spatial unity. 2 states of consciousness are spatially unified when the objects or events they present us with are represented as occupying a common space, right? Maybe this is a successful analysis. And again, you find people who try and analyze it in terms of the unity of consciousness in terms of something about space, right? I think this one falls short as well. And it was useful to give the Bain and Chalmers quote where they gave you this example of the like sheer variety of mental states that can be part of an overall unified experience. It's not the case that all of the components of our unified experience place objects within space, right? You can have thoughts about mathematics or thoughts about the spice fields of Dune, or you can have emotions, that sense of melancholy. It's not clear that that's locating an object in space at all. So spatial unity seems like it won't be able to account for how those sorts of experiences come to be part of an overall phenomenal unity. Right? So something else is needed, right? Object unity and spatial unity both concern the sorts of things that are presented to us in experience, the objects or events that are presented to us. Maybe that's not the way to go. Maybe what unifies experience is something about to who or to whom, I never know which one it is, experiences are presented to, right? So go back to the quote from Bain earlier, where he was describing himself sitting at his computer, listening to jazz, writing philosophy, eating olives. What unified those experiences? Well, maybe what unified them is that they're all presented to Bain. Right? There's a common subject there, right? So maybe we can analyze the unity of consciousness in terms of subject unity. 2 states of consciousness are subject unified when those states of consciousness are experienced by the same subject of experience. this is where it depends how we count things, whether there's 3 or 4 analyses, right? If you read the R experienced here in a sort of timeless way, we have a problem, right? A person can have a variety of experiences over the course of their life, right? You might be cold right now, you might be warm in the future. Those are all, in a sense, presented to the same subject, but they're not phenomenally unified, right? Now you might think that, look, this is me like intentionally misunderstanding this sort of proposal, right? Because there's a very easy fix to it. You just have to put a temporal index here, right? Don't pull one of these metaphysician moves where you read verbs in a timeless manner, right? Read it like a normal person. There's a temporal index there, right? So maybe we can analyze the unity of consciousness in terms of the subject unity plus temporal index. 2 states of consciousness are subject unified when those states of consciousness are experienced by the same subject of experience at the same time. So what unifies those experiences in the example from Bain isn't just that they're presented to Bain, but they're presented to him at once, right? I think there might be some sort of success here, but I think there's all sorts of problems with this sort of analysis. And the main problem that arises is that you're substituting one mystery for another mystery. You're failing to make explanatory progress here, right? If we leave this notion of a subject of experience unanalyzed, then we've just very clearly substituted one mystery for another. It might turn out to be true, but it's not theoretically sort of pleasing in that sort of way, right? There's another worry here that it seems to reverse the order of explanation. There's a lot of different analyses or accounts that try and explain what a subject of experience is, right? At least a large proportion of these try and analyze this basic or minimal subject of experience in terms of the unity of consciousness. So there we've gotten the explanatory work backwards, right? And probably most importantly for my paper here is that I'm going to argue that what's doing all the work here in this subject unity plus temporal indexing is the temporal component. That it's just the temporal component that's doing the work, the subject drops out, and I'm going to show you how that works. Okay, so basically I'm going to give a better analysis than this one, okay? All right, so what are some of the upshots from all of this? Well, here's some things that I think we can learn that a successful analysis of the unity of consciousness should exhibit. Any proposed account of the unity of consciousness must range over a sufficiently wide class of mental states. It must be able to unify not just exteroceptive sensory perception like vision and audition, but also have things like affective components and conscious cognitive states and so on, right? Given the sheer variety of the contents of these sorts of mental states, it seems that what unifies our very experiences ultimately operates over concerns are mental states themselves and not the objects of those mental states, okay? There's a little bit more of a leap on that point, right? But I think it's sort of like an inductive sort of inference that I'm drawing here, okay? And then finally, it's just this, again, this worry about explanatory progress. We shouldn't try to explain the unity of consciousness by appealing to something either equally or more mysterious, okay? So I'm going to give a proposal in a moment, and I'm going to give a moment for people to take photos of this. All right. Okay. Okay. So here I'm going to give the proposal. It's going to be relatively quick because I think it's a very simple analysis, but I think it's the right one, right? Before I give the proposal, I think it's useful to notice that I'm not the first person to point to some sort of interesting connection between the unity of consciousness and our experience of time or something about time. Like, historians tell me, I'm not a historian at all, right? But, Kant and the Neo-Kantians had this. Apparently it goes back to Plato as well, that there's some sort of connection between time and the unity of consciousness, right? What I want to start out with, though, is note that even these authors that we use to specify our explanandum at the beginning of the talk, their characterizations of them already have this implicit connection between time and the unity of consciousness. So here's the quote from Bain and Chalmers and the quote from Brooke and Raymond. I've just bolded and underlined all of the temporal language, right? So for Bain and Chalmers, it's not any old experiences that are unified. It's that at any given time, you can have simultaneous visual experience. Those occur while, so temporally sort of overlapping with a stream of conscious thoughts, right? That's what is involved in something being part of a single encompassing state of consciousness. Brooke and Raymond do this even more explicitly. In their quote, they contrast a case in which you have unified experiences from a case in which you don't have unified experiences. And the very contrast that they're using is a temporal one. What's their example? The noise and the pain are experiences unified if they're simultaneous. The example that they give of the disunified case is you first hear the noise and then you feel the pain, right? Now, the thing, and this is really where the sort of like deflationary aspect of my analysis comes from, is that all of these authors have thought that there's something deeper to this phenomena. I think they're just mistaken. There's nothing deeper to this phenomena than the right sort of analysis of how we're experiencing our own mental lives unfolding in time. Okay, so that's what I'm going to exploit in this proposal. So in the same way that I was sort of characterizing forms of unity with objects and space and subject, here's a form of unity that we have in our experience, okay? And something that I call temporal unity. Two states of consciousness are temporally unified when those experiences appear to be located in a common timeline. So I'm very much doing this by analogy to the spatial case, right? So objects are spatially unified if they're contained in a common space. Mental states are temporally unified if they appear to occur in a common timeline. Okay. So, I don't know what that sounded like. Okay. So we're gonna get to the proposal in a moment. Okay. Resetting in a moment. Okay, we're gonna get to the proposal in a moment, right? But I think the proposal that I'm going to offer does better than the analyses that we saw earlier. It does better than object unity because it's not restricted to individual objects or events, right? Multiple objects and events can occur within a timeline. Unlike spatial unity, temporal unity is defined over the apparent structure of our experiences or over the apparent structure of our mental lives, and not directly over the events or contents that are represented by those mental states. And this points to like an interesting distinction between how our mental lives seem to have a temporal structure in a way that they don't seem to have a spatial structure. Right, so we're going to do a little experiment here, a little survey. I don't know, something, right? There's participation. Think about that experience of melancholy that Bain and Chalmers mentioned, right? Let that dwell for a moment. Think about cases where you experience that, how it makes you feel, right? Okay. Now, what's the square root of 9? Okay, lots of you had answers to this, right? Okay. Now, if I asked you, which of those mental states or thoughts or experiences was bigger than the other? Spatially bigger than the other? It's a weird question, right? If I asked you, which of those was further to the left than the other? That seems even more confused. It seems like I've made a category mistake, that I've misunderstood something fundamental about space or the mind or both, right? But what if I asked you the temporal analogs of those? Which of those experiences lasted longer, had a longer temporal duration, right? That seems like it's something you can answer. Which of those experiences happened before, earlier than the other one? Again, that seems like it's a perfectly sensible question. And in fact, in many cases, it's easy enough to answer, right? Our mental lives seem to have a temporal structure in a way that they don't have an apparent spatial structure, okay? That's ultimately what I'm going to be exploiting in this analysis, okay? And this is a promissory note. So unlike spatial unity, I think I can sort of discharge some of the mystery about this aspect of how we experience our mental lives being structured in time. Okay. So what's the actual proposal then? Phenomenal unity can be understood in terms of how our mental lives seem to unfold in a common timeline. Phenomenal unity can be analyzed in this way. Two states of consciousness are synchronically unified. Just get rid of the word synchronic. That was from an earlier version of this talk. Are unified just in case they are experienced as occurring simultaneously. So the conscious states are unified if those conscious states appear to be or experienced as being simultaneous. Okay, that's the proposal. It's a very simple analysis, right? So I'm going to leave it there for a moment, because that's it. Okay. All right. Now, here's where we start to sort of cash out this analysis and try and make it a little bit more plausible, right? Like I said at the beginning of the last section, that there's some sort of connection between time and the unity of consciousness isn't a new thing, right? It's a fact that people sort of gleaned onto for ages, right? My analysis is very simple. Surely someone's come up with this sort of analysis at some point, and surely there's arguments against it, right? And there are arguments that you find in the literature that try to show that you can't give an analysis of the unity of consciousness in terms of something about the temporal structure of our experience, okay? And here's one example of that sort of argument, right? This is the sort of argument that you find in most cases, right? And the version that I'm giving is just a version that you find in the work of Barry Dayton and Oliver Rashbrook, okay? And their argument appeals to sort of a philosopher's idealized version of a split brain case. So are people familiar with split brain cases? Yeah, some. Okay, so split brain cases, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, are these cases where individuals have the two cerebral hemispheres separated so that they can't communicate directly with one another. This is done in real life to treat severe cases of epilepsy and stuff like that. In the philosopher's version, the severing of the two hemispheres is complete. There's absolutely no communication between the two hemispheres. Okay. Now, something interesting that happens with split brain patients is that both of the hemispheres remain relatively healthy and continue to process information and stimuli, right? So if you take a split brain patient and you present to them simultaneously a phone in this half of the visual field, so your left half of the visual field, and a bottle in your right visual field, and you ask the split brain patient, what are they experiencing, right? Well, they'll tell you that they see a Coke bottle. Why? Because the right half of the visual field is processed by the left hemisphere, which typically houses our language production capacities. So people are able to report that. If you ask them, are you seeing a phone? They'll say no, right? But then you ask them to draw what they see with their left hand. Now, their left hand is controlled by their right cerebral hemisphere, which is also processing the visual input having to do with their phone. And guess what they draw? They draw a phone. This is sort of an extreme example of it, but that's the basic idea, right? So you have all this complex processing happening in both hemispheres, and arguably, and there's a big arguably here, right? We could just grant it. The person, so the body, let's put it that way, is housing two different experiences at the very same time. A visual experience of the bottle and a visual experience of the phone, right? So there's simultaneous experiences, right? But there's no unity here, right? So the mere simultaneity of these experiences is clearly insufficient to account for the unity of consciousness. There's got to be something over and above whatever's been found in the split brain case, right? Now, Dayton's solution is to go primitive here, right? I'm not going to go that way, obviously. So how do I respond to this, right? It seems like a clear-cut case that the mere temporal structure of experience isn't enough to capture the unity of consciousness. And there's a sense in which the objection's correct, but it just doesn't apply to my proposal. The proposal that I'm giving isn't in terms of the actual or objective temporal structure of our experiences or of our mental lives. The proposal I'm giving is in terms of the apparent temporal structure of our mental lives. In the split brain patient, there's no sort of awareness or sense of the temporal relationship between the experience of the bottle and the experience of the phone, right? But it's that apparent temporal relationship that I'm going to appeal to. And importantly, and here's where we start getting into a little bit of sort of empirical work. The objective temporal structure of our experiences can come apart from the apparent temporal structure of our experiences. These things are dissociable, right? And if we can show that there's this sort of dissociation, that these things are in fact distinct, then I can get around Dayton's objection, okay? So in order to show that these two things can come apart, we're going to look at a classic finding in the literature on temporal perception that's been called either temporal binding effect or the causal binding effect or the intentional binding effect. It gets called differently in different literatures. And the particular case that I'm going to look at comes from the work of Stetson et al. From 2007. Okay, so this is how the study works. Subjects are put in front of a computer monitor and they're asked to press a button. Okay. Approximately 35 milliseconds after they press the button, a flash of light appears on the computer screen in front of them. Okay. Now, subjects in this condition, they report two things about their experience. One, that the button press reliably occurs before the flash of light. And second, that it's their pressing of the button that has some sort of causal control over the flash of light. And if you just imagine yourself in this situation, seems like a natural description, right? But in fact, there's no causal control here. It was just a cleverly designed study where the flash occurred approximately 35 milliseconds after the button press. Okay, so people do this for an unbearable amount of time, and then immediately after that, they're put into another block of trials where the conditions are slightly different. In this second block of trials, there's an extended delay that's been inserted between the button press and the flash of light. Now there's 135 milliseconds between the button press and the flash of light. Now our perceptual systems have this really interesting tendency. If we're presented with events that seem to be related in terms of cause and effect, we have what Christoph Horl and Teresa McCormack have called a Humean tendency. We want cause and effect events to be temporally contiguous with one another. In the same way that, if a billiard ball is going to exert some sort of causal influence over another one, they need to be in spatial contact. Well, we think that events should be in temporal contact. So subjects are put in this extended delay condition, and depending on which version of the study, this is probed in different ways, but you can find that there's a certain sort of contraction that's happening. As the block of trials goes along, our perceptual system tries to drag the cause and effect closer together in time. Okay, so you can imagine sort of perceptual systems playing this like tug of war and pulling things together. Okay. That's already an interesting finding, right? But the real interesting finding comes in the third block of trials. Subjects are immediately put back into a block of trials where the stimulus conditions are identical to the first set of conditions. So once again, there's a button press, and objectively, about 35 milliseconds later, a flash of light appears on the screen. What subjects report, though, is a very peculiar thing. They describe their experiences as though there's a reversal of the temporal order of cause and effect, that the flash of light is occurring prior to their button press. Right? And you can imagine what's happening here. The perceptual system is trying to draw these things together, right? It's fighting against this delay that's sort of inserting this gap between causes and effects. So it's pushing things together. And when that delay is removed, the perceptual system overshoots. Okay? So it places the effect prior to the cause. Right? Now, subjects in these cases, the Stetson et al. Study didn't quite get this, but later versions of this sort of study note that subjects don't only report the timing of events in the world appearing to be flipped, but they also report their own mental lives as being seemingly flipped. that their experience of the flash of light comes prior to their experience of having pressed the button, right? There's this weird thing that's happened there. Now, this alone hasn't shown that the apparent temporal structure of our mental lives comes apart from the objective timing of our mental lives, right? It just shows that you can have weird experiences in strange experimental conditions, right? But I think there's an argument that could be made that can push us a little bit further to think that the apparent and objective temporal structure of our lives, mental lives, come apart, right? We're here in this case, we're talking about visual experiences and tactile experiences. There's other versions of these studies that have done it with audio cases, audio-visual, visual-tactile. You can just keep on coming up with the different combinations, and you can find these effects in almost every variation, right? But in this case, we have visual experiences and a tactile experience. You might think that the objective timing of those experiences is somehow tied to activity in those specific sensory cortices, right? That the timing of your visual experience is tied to something happening in your visual processing. Timing of your tactile experience has something to do with tactile processing and so on, right? So if the apparent timing of our experience matched, so if there was a change in the apparent timing of our experiences and that matched a change in the objective timing of our experiences, you would think that there'd be some sort of change or a shift in the timing of these sensory specific processes, right? Now they've run these sorts of studies with all sorts of different imaging techniques, and what they've found is that there's no shift in the timing of these sensory specific processes. There's some very limited cases where you get recalibration effects where you do have shifts, but those have to do with perception of like rhythmic stimuli, right? So we have, let's see what's on. So I think, take it that we have some sort of empirical reasons for thinking that the apparent timing of our mental lives comes apart from the objective timing of our mental lives, right? Once you have that distinction, then I'm able to respond to the Dayton's objection, right? It's not just that it's the objective timing that explains or accounts for the unity of consciousness. It's about the apparent timing of our mental lives that does that. Okay. So what unifies experience is not the actual temporal structure of our mental lives. It's not the unified temporal structure of events or something like that that are represented by experience, but it's the apparent temporal structure of our mental lives themselves. Yeah, okay. So that's the proposal again, sort of defended, put in a slightly different way, right? Now, I haven't quite met Van Gulik's challenge yet, though. It seems like I've simply, if you look at the literature on temporal experience and temporal perception, it's an incredibly complex literature. It's really kind of messy. People have been writing on it for ages and ages and ages. People take it to be a big mystery, right? So look, have I really made any sort of explanatory progress by taking the unity of consciousness and said, aha, look, I'm going to explain it in terms of this thing that we have a firm grasp on, temporal experience? It seems like probably not, right? So what I'm going to do in the next section is I'm going to try and demystify this phenomena. There's still lots of questions that remain unanswered, lots of things that we don't know about how we experience events in the world as being temporally structured, let alone our own mental lives as being temporally structured. But I think some of the basics are there, right? And it opens up problems that are sort of typical to the cognitive sciences, right? No deep mysteries here, just things that need to be worked on, okay? So, okay, I already said this, how we simply replace one mystery for another. The strategy that I want to adopt here in this section is going to go in this way. Ultimately, I want to say something about how we come to experience or represent our mental lives as being temporally structured in a certain way. How am I going to do that? Well, first I'm going to say something about how we come to perceive events in our world as being temporally structured. And then I'm going to employ what philosophers have called the mirroring principle and a few other bits and pieces to get us to an account of the apparent temporal structure of our mental lives. Okay, so that's the sort of strategy. Okay, so it's all going to come up together quite quickly at the end. Okay, but it's going to be useful to explain what the mirroring principle is. So for those of you who are familiar with the relatively recent literature on temporal experience, you will have come across this mirroring principle. Okay. There's a long quote from Matt Soteriou. I'm not going to read it, but it's easier to explain what it is. The mirroring principle just says, look, the apparent temporal structure of our experiences mirrors the temporal structure of the events that are represented by that experience. Okay. The principle is relatively easy to get through an example. So imagine you're sitting somewhere and there's a thunderstorm off in the distance, right? You see the flash of lightning, and then after a short delay, you hear the rumble of the thunder, right? So, we know that this isn't the case. We know that these are actually simultaneous events, but still perception seems to present the lightning is happening prior to the thunder, right? And it seems as though your experience of the lightning occurs prior to your experience of the thunder, right? Now, as that thunderstorm approaches and gets closer and closer, the gap between the lightning and the thunder seems to shrink. And once the storm gets on top of you, they seem to be simultaneous. Well, as that thunderstorm's getting closer and closer to you, not only does there seem to be a shrinking in the gap between the events in the world, the lightning and the thunder, but there also seems to be a shrinking gap between your experience of the lightning and your experience of the thunder, right? There's a mirroring here between how perception's presenting the world and how our own mental lives seem to be structured. This is the mirroring principle, right? It gets used by a number of authors in different ways. All I needed to do is show that there's some relationship between the apparent timing of our mental lives and the timing of events presented by those experiences. Okay, so this is going to come up later. Now it's time to talk about temporal perception for a little while. Okay. So this is stuff that I've talked about in a lot of my other work. Temporal perception for a long time was treated as something like a singular psychological capacity. There was this thing, the perception of time, in the same way that you have vision or audition or any of these other sorts of capacities. And it was thought to operate through a single internal clock mechanism. Sometimes you still hear people talk about temporal perception in this way, that there's a pacemaker or something inside of you that keeps track of time, right? So the thought was you had all this incoming sensory stimulation through your different sensory processes, sensory systems, and you had an internal timekeeper that was simply keeping track of how long visual processes were happening or how long auditory processes were happening. And then it would take that measurement and then export the property out to the event in the world, right? If a visual process took longer than an auditory process, well, the visual event was longer than the auditory event, right? If one occurred prior to the other, well, the events in the world were related in that way. That's how people thought about temporal perception for quite a long time, definitely from the 1950s through the early 2000s, right? There's lots of reasons for thinking that sort of account fails. Right? It would take us too far afield to really go into that. I've written about this a lot, so I can answer questions about it. But there seems to be an emerging view that temporal perception is really a fragmented capacity. We have a lot of different timekeeping capacities that are in some ways strikingly specialized. And how is this shown in the evidence? Well, using standard dissociation data that you would use in the cognitive sciences. Through various different sorts of interventions, you're able to disrupt people's capacity to perceive time at various time scales. So above or below 1 second, above or below 250 milliseconds. There's lots of different contrasts here, right? You're able to produce distortions of temporal perception within specific modalities while leaving other modalities untouched. So you can have a distortion of visual temporal perception where a visual event seems to take longer, but your auditory timekeeping capacity still works fine, right? You get these strange experiences, right? You even have dissociations between types of temporal properties. So you can have illusions of duration that don't influence things like rhythm or rate, right? You can have distortions of rhythmic versus non-rhythmic stimuli, right? You have all of this strange heterogeneity, right? So temporal perception is, at least in some ways, initially fragmented, okay? But this fragmentation was really just discovered through interesting experimental protocols. When you reflect on how the world seems to you, the world seems to contain a single unified timeline, right? There seems to be some sort of like seamlessness to time, right? All of your different sensory experiences seem to locate or can locate events within this common timeline. These events can be related in terms of earlier than, later than relations. There doesn't seem to be any sharp divide between, 50 to 250 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds to a second to beyond, right? That all seems to sort of like smoothly and seamlessly flow into one another. So how do you get to this unified experience of time from these initial fragments, right? Okay. You might think that this problem isn't really unique to time. You might think that you have an analogous problem with space, right? So, we gather information about space and how objects and events are located in space through our different sensory modalities. We even know that within individual sensory modalities, there's different ways of representing space. There's different spatial representations, say within vision, that might be specific for color or shape and motion and things like that, right? So maybe if we understand how this sort of integration occurs within the spatial domain, we'll have an account of how it occurs in the temporal domain. Okay. I think there's going to be some sort of problems with the straightforward analogy. Okay. While there's various ways in which spatial information gets integrated within and across modalities, here's one popular story for how it works. And it has to do with what you might call the alignments of different sorts of maps. Okay. So within the visual system, we have spatial maps that are specialized for encoding information about the location of different types of properties in our visual field. Sometimes this notion of map is understood in more abstract form, but there are ways, or there's like strong evidence that we do in fact have sort of layouts of neurons in the visual cortex that preserve spatial relations with the visual field, right? There's interesting studies that were done with macaques back in the day to show this. So how does integration then of spatial information work with these map-like representations? Well, it's essentially a process of aligning the maps with one another through some sort of shared landmarks, right? If you've ever seen the movie The Goonies, there's a good example of this at the very beginning. So they have their treasure map, right? They have like an image of the coastline and a location of the map, but they don't know where that is relative to themselves. And then they find a map of the Oregon coast. And what they do is they're able to superimpose the treasure map on the map of the Oregon coast by finding common landmarks. Some peninsula in there's like peninsulas and stuff like that they're able to use to align these maps. And once the maps are aligned, you have a straightforward account of how you can integrate information. You just have an identification of locations across these maps, and you just sort of aggregate those maps, and you've combined their content. And there's evidence of this sort of process happening in various areas of our psychology. It seems to happen in visual binding within the visual system. It happens with gaze control in the superior colliculus. It even occurs in peripersonal visual tactile space, right? You have this alignment of maps. Right? Now, one of the things that's happening in this alignment process is that you're exploiting how all of these maps share a common sort of structure. They all have a map-like format. They all represent overlapping areas of space. And once you have that, all you need to do is to have a system that detects simultaneity across these maps, right? All you need to do is say, there's a signal here and there's a signal here, so there's a combination of those signals. That's how the world is, right? Okay, it's a very easy process, right? So you would think that this might work for the temporal domain. But it seems as though all of these different sorts of timekeeping capacities I was pointing to earlier don't share anything like a map-like format. They encode information about time in strikingly different ways. Again, it would take us a little bit too long to go into the details here, so I can talk about that later, right? Some seem to employ something that could be described as an analog or map-like format, where there's a property of the system that increases with, say, the increased duration of something that's represented. Others seem to completely lack that. There even seem to be systems that represent time in a binary fashion through a series of different distinct oscillatory mechanisms. Right? The sorts of representational structures that are exploited in this sort of alignment process simply aren't there. Right? Something else needs to be appealed to. This is a bit more speculative here, but another way of understanding how integration of temporal information might work across these modalities is to find an alternative sort of landmark that allows you to coordinate content across these timekeeping mechanisms. Okay. And in the spatial case, you actually used the landmark. It was just shared objects, right? It was the peninsula in the map of the Oregon coast and in the treasure map that allowed the alignment to work, right? That's not going to work in this case in a straightforward sense, but maybe there's something similar to it. And the suggestion that I'm going to give here is that it has to do with event structure. It's identification of events, and in particular, identification of causal structure of the world that is playing a role in integrating these different sorts of temporal mechanisms. Right? Now, why think that causal principles are involved in this sort of integration or this aspect of our temporal perception? Right? Well, there's a number of reasons why. The sort of phenomena that I gave you earlier with the Stetson study, with the pressing of the button and the flash of light, those sorts of temporal recalibration effects only occur when there's an apparent causal relationship between those events. Right? If you damage or disrupt the apparent causal relationship there, the recalibration effect goes away. Right? And this sort of recalibration effect doesn't even require your own action to be one of the events. There could be causal relationships between different sorts of events in the world, and you get the same sort of temporal recalibration effect. That's cause and effect principles involved in temporal perception. Same cause or common cause principles also seem to be operative in our temporal perception. You see this when you're watching a movie where the audio and visual tracks are slightly out of line. So I feel like this happens more when you download like a bootleg version of a movie where it's just like the auditory track and the visual track are just a little bit out of line. If the language of the audio track is the same as the the original language, you often get over it, as long as it's not too far of a discrepancy. You kind of get used to it after a little bit, right? If the movie is dubbed, though, in a different language, you never adapt to it. You never get used to it. Why? Well, there's more to this, but the explanation seems to be that in the dubbed case, the sounds that you're hearing don't seem like plausible candidates to be an effect of the same sort of movement of the mouth that you're seeing, right? So your visual signals that you're getting and the auditory signals that you're getting don't seem to have a common cause. But if it's in the original language, your perceptual system's able to identify that, look, there seems to be something like this event and that event have a common cause, right? There's other sorts of cases where causal perception or cues about causal relationships influence temporal perception. And these have to do with Michaud-style launching paradigms. If you're familiar with the literature on causal perception, you'll be familiar with these. These are studies where you just have a block, it moves, and then there's this other block. When they come into causal contact with each other, the second block moves. Gives you a sense of causal connection, right? There's versions of these launching paradigms, though, where you have cues that this block is going to cause this block to move. But in fact, this second block moves before this first one does, right? Now, you have this sort of discrepancy. Causal cues tell you that one should be moving before the other. The actual objective timing of your stimulation is that, well, the other one moves first. What happens with this sort of conflict? Well, causal cues take over. Causal cues will influence the ordering of these events in time. Right? Temporal perception seems to be influenced by causal reasoning principles and event cognition principles. Right? Now, interestingly, a lot of these causal principles have to do with how events from detected in different modalities or even within the same modality are located within a timeline. They have less to do with things about duration and things like that. They can still influence it, but it seems like they're playing a really significant role in laying out or placing events in time. That's the sort of aspect of our temporal experience that I thought was really important for the unity of consciousness. Okay, and I'll finish up in a couple minutes now. Okay, so causal reasoning is event-based. This event-based principles are influencing how we perceive time, right? But everything that I've told you so far is about exteroceptive senses, right? How we perceive the events in the world is being laid out in time, and via the mirroring principle, this tells you something about how our experiences of those events seem to be laid out in time, right? But one of the criticisms of a number of accounts of the unity of consciousness is that you had to account for things like affect, emotions, conscious thoughts. How do those things enter into this picture? And this is really where more speculative stuff works or comes into play. But it seems as though, right, that's what I just said, causal reasoning principles are also employed in our having a sense of how our mental life in general unfolds in time. So in like a recent piece that I wrote with Chris Goffin on emotions, we talk about how the structure of emotions, the phenomenal structure of emotions is tied up with causal reasoning principles there, right? But you get a good sense of this when you think about things like confabulation. Or let me take a step back actually first. Our mental lives don't seem to unfold in a separate timeline than the events in the world do, right? They all seem to be events that are located within this unified timeline that we live our lives in, right? And it's really like easy to think of cases where someone said something and then a thought came to mind. I said something and an objection came to your mind, right? You get the sense, it's a very clear sense that not only was there a causal relationship between what I said and what happened in your mind, but there's a temporal relationship there as well. You heard what I said first, and then the thought came to mind, right? This sort of causal link between apparent temporal structure and causal structure is apparent in things like confabulation as well. If you look at the literature on confabulation, a lot of that literature points to confabulations arising from our trying to make causal sense of the world. And a lot of confabulations have to do with misplaced or displaced timings of events. So you see this clearly in cases of like severe confabulation with people like dementia. They might sort of report having an experience at a certain time, but really they're reporting something that happened far in their past, right? But nevertheless, the story they give you is kind of like causally coherent, right? This also happens, if you have a fight or an argument with your partner or something like that, and it's like, who said what first or who had this thought first, right? It's very easy to confabulate in a way that, makes a causal story where you're in the right, okay? Yeah. So there's causal principles, the very same sorts of causal principles that seem to be operative in exteroceptive perception seem to be employed in our understanding of the temporal structure of our own mental lives, right? So here's the idea, right? All of that phenomena that I've just described about locating events in time, whether they're in the world or in our own minds, seems to be the sort of stuff that we can study using the standard toolkit of the cognitive sciences. Right? It's something about how information about the world is represented. And it seems as though we have a grasp of how some of this information gets integrated. Right? Event cognition, causal reasoning cognition seem to be at play. So if that's right, temporal unity is, as I was describing it, is just a result of this more general capacity to understand or experience events as being laid out in time, which in turn involves things like cognitive or causal reasoning capacities and event cognition, right? So temporal unity can be studied using the standard toolkit, and therefore the phenomenal unity can be studied using the same thing, right? So here's a conclusion. The unity of consciousness is nothing more than temporal unity. There's no deeper fact to the unity of consciousness than the apparent temporal relationship between our experiences. That's it. Thank you.
We have 10 minutes for a break. So raise your hands, please. More hands? Who else? Okay, we start with Axel.
Gracias. Oh, this is great. Thank you. So my first question is the other. Doesn't the unity of phenomenal consciousness seem like something too immediate to be the process of all this alignment and construction of causal coherence? So wouldn't that be also an objection to the process?
Yeah,
Sort of.
yeah. I think that helps clarify something about the proposal that I'm giving, right? So think about it just how we perceive space, not about unity of consciousness, which is about locating objects from space. There is a lot of work that happens in the visual system or in our different sensory systems that leads to that seamless experience that seems immediate.
Really?
Yeah. So processes of the sort that I was just describing seem to be at play, leading to that sort of experience. You can get the apparent location. So think of something like apparent motion. So apparent motion are these phenomena where you just have a light flash and another light flash, and you can do this with a bunch of other flashes, right? And you just get this immediate sense that there's this one object moving along, right? If the stimulus is presented in the right sort of way, right? What's giving rise to that? Well, it seems as though similar sorts of causal principles are at play there, right? That if you're able to sort of disrupt something about the apparent causal relationship between things, then the phenomenon falls apart. There's another nice example that's a cross-modal one, where you're presented with an image where there's two dots on either corner of the screen, and they go like this. You get it, right? Without any sound, you see these things that are sort of passing through each other, and this one ends here and this one ends here. But at the moment that the dots come into contact, you hear a beep. Yeah. What ends up happening is you perceive it this way. And again, that seems seamless. There's no inference that you're like explicitly drawing. There's no sort of work. You're not putting work in, right? But there's all this complexity. Follow-ons.
Yeah.
Okay, so but then that means that this discrepancy between
How slowly it moves around.
between the objective simultaneity and the perceived apparent simultaneity is actually the rule, because there has to be a process that gets from one to the other. Okay, thank you.
We have Pedro.
Oh, thank you very much for your talk. I didn't like the reason you gave when you say that the subject unity is not the reason why two different perceptions are unified.
Yeah.
And the reason why is that, well, that there are perceptions in different times and they are not unified. And I was shocked when I hear that, because of course they are unified. I mean, it isn't the same thing to see a fruit or an object for the first time and when you have seen that many times. So they are, I would say, different perceptions in time are unified. Now you could say, well, but we are explaining here a case of unity which is constructed precisely at the same time. But then the objection could be, well, yeah, but this synchronic unity is just a case of diachronic unity, which is the main, I would say, as Kantian, the main problem to be explained. Well, that's
Okay, good. So there's you're right, in the sense that these different experiences across time, there's some form of unity to them. Seeing a peculiar fruit for the first time is very different than seeing it again later on in life. Stuff like that. part of my like divide and conquer strategy here was just mirroring some of the distinctions that you find in the literature on the unity of consciousness. That we distinguish between the sense in which consciousness is unified at a given moment, and that seems like a different form of unity than the unity that might happen across time, or especially over long temporal intervals, like the one you were just describing, right? So, you know, just following the literature, I was focusing on this this synchronic unity, and I sort of betrayed myself by leaving that word in a couple times in the slides. Now, you might think that these forms of unity are all related in one way because they're all subject unified, or there's something that sort of makes them coherent in some way. You might think that there's nevertheless cases where you can have unified experiences at a given moment where the diachronic experience seems to come apart. So sometimes cases of disunified experience are always controversial. But in some cases, you can think of people who have like dissociative episodes, right? Where the world seems completely novel to them. It's kind of this like very uncomfortable sort of feeling where everything, in a sense, seems like unfamiliar and fake. But there's, but nevertheless, at that moment, they have a synchronic unified experience. Now, you might still think that there's a subject unity, right? And you can even find cases where, you have these dissociative identity disorders where people don't have an identity or don't have a sense of an identity of the subject across time, but nevertheless, in individual moments, there's still this unified synchronic sense of unity. Now, that's kind of like following the literature. I think the account that I've given here, though, which has been developed specifically for synchronic unity, applies perfectly well to the diachronic unity as well. But there's like a whole host of other questions that arise in diachronic cases that it just wouldn't fit within a paper. But in earlier versions of this, I tried to do that, where, the two things are really at root something about how we experience time. And then we can disagree as to what role the subject's actually playing in there. I think a lot of what can be said without appealing to either a real subject or even a sense of subject.
We have Esteban, then Sebas.
Thank you very much, Gerardo. Very, very interesting. And I have a kind of one question, right? Okay. But mostly clarificatory. So your talk was super clear, but I'm a little slow. So I just want to understand. And so you insisted that one of the upshots of the earlier discussion is that we should take into account the states and not just their content to account for unity. Yeah. And I'm wondering what is the place of that. One sub-question is, you're thinking of states as vehicles of the contents. Okay, and in part, and well, there is a second question, but didn't fully understand what would you say in the split brain cases? Of course, controversial how much disunity there is, but in experimental situations, you can tell, you can make it look as though there's two different subjects. One sees the Coke and the other the phone. So why is there's no unity there if you're not taking into account the subject? Yeah. But what would look like there is that there's two subjects, right? So you think just time, no subject.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay. So let me start with the easier one first. The first thing that you did about the distinction between those two. Yeah. Part one. The distinction between content and mental states themselves that I was making. So look at the account of spatial unity that I described. Spatial unity there was described in terms of spatial relations that are thought to hold between the objects that are represented by the experience, right? Like this thing and this thing stand in certain spatial relationships, right? What I just meant by saying like the account of unity has to operate over the mental states themselves or be directed at the mental states is instead of being directed at what those experiences represent, it's telling you something about how a mental state relates to another mental state, right? So that's what I meant. If you want to put this in terms of vehicles, someone can put it in terms of vehicles, right? But I thought being sort of neutral as to how to characterize that difference is enough. Right.
But not, yeah, okay, not the contents of the states, but
yeah, I mean,
the states themselves.
The states themselves, but there's a sense in which the states bring along their contents. So it's you're not just representing the temporal relationship between a mental state thought of as a vehicle devoid of its content, right? But it's the experience, it's this mental state that has a certain sort of content standing in relation to another mental state that has another sort of content, right? You need the content in there to really get the unified stuff, right? So it's kind of like thinking about like this meta cognitive or meta representational capacity is like, taking, think of the bottle as the mental state and the liquid inside of it as the content. Mm-hmm. It takes the bottle and it brings it along with the contents of the bottle, right? So that's the idea, right? So then now part two, shifting gears. What's happening in the split brain case, right? You could try and account for the split brain case by saying, look, there's no unity here across the cerebral hemispheres because I think you get a story where it's like each hemisphere has its own subjective experiences. Given that there's experience here and experience here, there's a subject here and a subject there, right? So disunity arises because there's no unified subject, there's no common subject, right? Here's another story. There's nothing that's keeping track of the relative timing of one experience and the other experience. Now, you might think that in order for me to give an account of that sort of representational capacity, I must invariably bring in a subject, right? It's not clear that you obviously have to, right? And that's where I'm going, right? That what's happened in the split brain case is that you don't have, you can put it in very sort of mechanistic terms. There's no mechanism that's reaching into this hemisphere and that hemisphere to tell you something about the temporal relations between those, right? And that's why unity fails. So that's the story.
Follow up or a little follow up? Okay. Yeah, quick. So, okay, but the two parts were related because, of course, the states in both hemispheres and they're occurring simultaneously.
Yeah.
But there's no content or representation about their simultaneity.
Yeah.
And your account relies on the apparent and the apparent temporal unity, right? Yeah. That means that has to be related to content, right? But if there's no representation of the temporal unity, I don't know, that's not the temporal unity is not itself represented, then there's no unity of consciousness. It's sort of your proposal bottom line, right? But I guess you could then explain the self as the space that, right, that is represented as that temporal unity. Yeah. How would you go about that?
I mean, so there's the relationship between temporal unity and our experience of time and the self or our sense of self is there's clearly some sort of relationship there, right? What I was trying to do in this paper was to show, look, you can do a lot of work without having to posit the self or a sense of self to do the explanatory lifting, right? That a lot of this work is being done by whatever sort of capacities are within us that are keeping track of the timing of events. Okay. Now, and I've thought about this at different points that there's some sort of explanatory relationship between a sense of self and this unified experience. Okay. Accounts of subject unity try to explain the unity of consciousness in terms of something like a sense of the self or an actual self or a subject, right? Here's another way. We get this sense of temporal unity, and from that we get a notion of subject. And you can think about the notion of subject to being developed here, or that would result from this, in the same way that people will often talk about the minimal subject and experience being something like the thing that occupies the spatial perspective on the world. So you can sort of extend your sort of spatial perspective in sort of geometric fashion, and the thing at the origin point is the subject, right? Well, I think maybe you could do something like that, but it's not a spatial perspective. We have a particular sort of temporal perspective on our environment, and that might ground this sense of the self, right, or subject to it. Yeah, right. And there's more that I can say about that.
Sebas, he's
We cannot hear you.
No.
No. No.
maybe what we can do is maybe you can write down your question in the chat, and we go on with the next question.
Where is he?
I don't know. On the other side.
It seems to me that he's not in the exposition.
Sí, no aparece.
No parece.
Pero yo creo que ha de ser de acá porque me se ve el audio.
Sí.
Hacen que conectarlo, ¿no? Ahí
Ajá, sí, dice eso.
Lo que podemos hacer es pon tu pregunta en el chat y seguimos con la discusión y después te damos la palabra.
Tal vez tiene la pestaña de Chrome en mute. Que se oculta.
Yo creo que es acá.
Ah, ¿es acá?
Es acá, ¿no?
Ahí, en eso.
Yeah, you have to enable the audio. No, yeah.
Sí.
So let's then, if you write down your question, and then we ask the next question. So I have a question.
We will roll the unity experiment.
I have a question about the dialectics with spatial unity and temporal unity, because it seems to me that you change levels of description.
Okay.
So your main reason to reject, so the main explanatory power that is done by the integration in space is by map-like structures.
Yeah.
But one might claim that we posit maps in order to characterize vehicles or vehicles in a mechanistic accounts of the mind. So there is a kind of alignment that holds between different maps, and that gives you a mechanistic, or the beginnings of a mechanistic account of how that works. Now, your main reason to reject that approach is that there seems to be nothing like that for these different timekeeping mechanisms. But then when you give your account, you drop this talk about formats, and then you talk about what it is represented, which is causality and events.
Yeah.
And then the question arises whether you have a view about what the formats of that are. Otherwise, we are still with the following.
Yeah, good. Okay, yeah, good. So the stuff about causal reasoning principles and event-based cognition, there is a story of format in the background there. So in the literature on how, object perception works, or spatial perception works, there's a debate as to whether or not you can make do with simply imagistic representations, right? Can you integrate all this content just by superimposing maps? Or do you need a different sort of content, right? Do you need something discursive, like linguistically structured, something that has a object predicate structure, right? There's a debate in the spatial case. I don't know you've had views on this, right? I don't quite know how to make sense of that there. In the temporal case, I think my appeals to event cognition and causal reasoning and principles, I took it to be pointing like there seems to be something like a discursive element that's happening, that's at work here. And it's that story that's giving, so there's something about format and content there that's giving rise to something about how we experience time.
Okay, can I have a Full of.
You're the.
No, you're telling us I feel like.
You can authorize yourself.
Because you have a very easy argument against the map-like solution, that it presupposes a kind of solution to the problem you want to solve.
Yeah.
So in order to align different maps, the points of reference have been simultaneous.
Yeah.
So the system has to take them to be simultaneous.
Yeah.
So you need a solution to your problem for the other problem to get off the ground.
Mhm.
So then you have like a negative pointer. So why not make that?
Okay, so I think I might have missed.
So when you have the example you gave of the movie,
Yeah.
you have these superimposed maps.
Yeah.
But you have to take these elements that are taken to be co-referential
Yeah.
as being at the same time.
Yeah.
But that's precisely the kind of coordination or temporal integration that you want to explain. So for this map-like explanation to work, you need a solution to your problem.
Yeah.
And that's why you cannot just rely on that.
Okay. So I think there's going to be some sort of similarity in how there's landmarks employed in both cases. Now, there's something about the spatial case where landmarks are used in like an initial alignment of these maps. And then once those maps are aligned, the landmarks disappear. Okay. So you can see this really clearly in like the developmental studies of these different sorts of map-like alignments. And one case, you see it in the development of the superior colliculus, where in early developmental stages, if you have an auditory signal and a visual signal, it aligns the map at that early stage of development. And then subsequent use of these maps and integration of these maps that require landmarks that just sort of like now maps the locations across. If you don't have the map-like structures, that sort of initial alignment process doesn't carry over into subsequent uses because you don't have a clear mapping between locations or temporal locations. Right? So that's where the difference really comes out between the spatial case and the temporal case. And the thought is like in the temporal case, it seems as though, and like this is something that I've been struggling with, there seems to be something that requires a more discursive element that isn't there in the map-like alignment.
Nice. Maybe we go back to Sebas, and then if it works, we will be again.
No.
Do you write down your question in the chat? So not yet.
Okay.
So then we have Axel again, and then we go back to Sebas. So Axel, Esteban, and Pedro, and then Sebas when the question is Axel.
Okay, thanks a lot. So you insist more than once that this is not about simultaneity of the content of this experience, but of the apparent simultaneity of the experiences themselves, right? Yeah. But the whole process that you give is about the contents, is about the simultaneity of the content.
The apparent simultaneity of the content.
Yeah, apparent simultaneity, exactly, of the contents, not of the states.
Yeah.
So then, okay, the unity of consciousness is the apparent simultaneity of the contents of our experiences.
Yeah, okay, yes.
So it's not of this.
Okay, yeah. So, there's like a story to be told here that goes in stages. Okay, right. Where here's the story that I'm giving. First, so ignore cognitive states and stuff like that. Let's talk about sensory states. First, what the perceptual system is gearing to do is get at the temporal order of things in the world. Mm-hmm. Right? Yes. And it does all sorts of work to try and uncover how events in the world are temporally related to one another. So it's doing that. Then there's some sort of process that's characterized by this mirroring principle. How that works, I have no idea, right? There's really like a big question mark there. But given that we come to perceive the world as having a certain sort of temporal structure, our mental lives seem to have a corresponding mental temporal structure, right? And it's really this later bit about the apparent temporal structure of our mental lives that my account of unity relies on, right? So there's a stepwise process.
But why? I mean, the mirroring principle is telling us that they are parallel. Therefore, you still need to give us a reason of why it is the apparent simultaneity at this level that is the one that gives the unity of consciousness and not unity at this
Well,
level.
because certain things that can be integrated into the unity of consciousness simply don't place events in time whatsoever. Right? So you can have a current thought about like, abstract mathematics. That's not representing some event as being located in time, but nevertheless, your experience of that, it seems to be located at a moment in time.
But then that unity cannot be explained by your mechanism because all your mechanism is involved with coherence in terms of causal, and that is not going to reach those abstract thoughts.
It doesn't, the causal story doesn't reach to the mathematical content, but it can reach to the mental state itself.
How?
So think about having, think about when you've been in like a logic class or something like that, and the professor puts a problem on the board, and you're trying to come up with a solution. You're trying to do a proof to it or something like that, right? You can have a sense of your solution to it coming at a certain moment in time, right? That's the sort of sense that I'm appealing to. Right? It's the mental states, regardless of whatever content they have, seem to occur at moments in time, and that can have, that can be influenced by causal reasoning principles in the same way as anything else. It might have been that you overheard someone say, start it this way or assume this, but you confabulate so that you think you were the ingenious person there, right?
Can I keep following up? Or?
We have 3 questions, so it's short.
Yeah, very, very. But then isn't there the experience that is actually being integrated is the experience of you finding out, which is again an event in time, and then it is the simultaneity of that finding out what that is going through the causal.
Okay, I have to think about this then, right? So I was thinking about a lot of these like introspective mental states. Mm-hmm. You characterize them not in terms of how you just did it, right? About you finding out you actively doing this, but rather about just like the thought coming to mind, right? That's how I was thinking about it. But yeah, that's an interesting way. Thank you.
So maybe we already have the question on the chat. Let's see. Can we see? Yes, there is a question, but I don't know how to.
Yes, right now. He's writing it now.
So then we have Esteban and then.
I'll go straight to the point. Not to take too much time out of other people. A variant of the split brains case. People or patients with dissociative identity disorder, multiple personalities. Oftentimes they're not just like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Like some of the various personalities are co-conscious. Right. So you may have a personality. One that seems to be in charge of the body, and another personality that is witnessing everything, right? And personality 1 does not even perceive personality 2, seems to be to other people the only one there. And in some other moment, like under hypnosis, we get 2 to be able to speak, and she recalls everything. Now, she didn't perceive any of the states of personality 1 as her own. So, isn't your story forced to tell us that that there's a unity of consciousness there? I don't think it's as an objection, because I think the best account of that is that you have only one self and one person that is deceived. But many people don't agree with me. So
It's kind of funny that you look at the quotes that I gave at the beginning that try to specify the unity of consciousness. They don't talk about ownership. Right. And the case that you're giving is one about ownership. So that might be a way to go about this, that there's a very peculiar unified experience that this person has. They're just attributing these things to different individuals, right? You also might think that there's something like this in the case of like somatoparaphrenia or something like that. These weird neurological disorders where people disown parts of their body, or they have these rubber hand illusions, or like things like this where there's something happening to them. They have a sort of qualitative feel, but it's not theirs. It's part of their overall experience in a sense. Again, like these things are like under-described in certain ways, right? So it gives me some sort of freedom to describe it in a way that's congenial with what I'm trying to say. But I think that's how I would do it.
Good.
Can someone read that, because I'm skipped out for me?
Yes. Hi, I would like to ask you about the notion of simultaneity. Sorry for pronunciation. It seems that we can have representations of things happening at the same time and yet not being unified. If this is correct, then simultaneity is not at the same time. Then the idea might be that the solution is representing things as happening now. In such a case, your view seems to be subject to a similar problem as the one faced by the subject view, explaining what is the now and explaining what is the self.
Okay, good. Can you leave it there?
Can you leave the... ¿Puedes dejarlo?
¿Puedes dejar?
Let's put that.
El chat para...
Gracias. Okay. Okay. So there's like maybe a imprecision in how I put the view in some places. We can represent things as being simultaneous in different ways. We can represent events as being simultaneous using concepts and cognition, right? But those things need to be unified in this way. But there's another sense in which we represent the timing of events in this more sort of immediate perceptual experiential sense, right? That's the notion of simultaneity that I have in mind, right? So the thought is that simultaneity there is important. But you're right, it's not just simultaneity. Things could have happened in the past in a simultaneous way. Things can happen in the future and be simultaneous, right? But really what's important is that what's unified is that they're happening right now, okay? How do we get now into perceptual content? That's actually a tricky question. I have like another paper presentation that I've been working on about that. And I can say something really briefly to try and articulate this. And it borders on reintroducing itself, but I'm pushing back on it. Okay. And the way it goes is like this. We have reasons for thinking that the perceptual system doesn't simply represent the state of the world at a given moment, but it has both predictive capacities and retrodictive capacities. It's able to represent a temporal interval or a sequence of events stretched out over time, right? But in order for a perception to guide action, it needs to be able to distinguish between those moments in time that you can causally interact with or causally influence from those moments in time that you're sort of incapable of causally influencing, right? Now, if you look at the metaphysics of time literature, a lot of people there try and analyze the present in terms of this sort of causal inflection point. What is the present? It's nothing more than the point that distinguishes those events that are causally influenceable from those events that aren't. So we might think that the perceptual system, in order to guide behavior appropriately, has to distinguish between those events that it can impact and those that it can't. That sort of inflection point is the perceptual now, right? Now, I just give you a characterization of that didn't really require anything about the self. You could easily get a self into that by saying the perceptual system distinguishes those things that I can influence versus those things that I can't, right? But I take it that you can get a lot of the same explanatory work without reintroducing that I-ness into them. All right, so let's respond, and this is helpful.
I tend to think that the solution to the case of now might be similar to the case of the I, self. Anyway, I would love to further discuss this with you. Not by chat.
Yeah, okay, yeah, not by that, right by it.
So you can present that paper in the seminar.
Yeah.
That's a seminar on this.
Okay, yeah, there's an indexical component, right?
Yes.
And it's just, how do you specify that indexical in this sort of, for this capacity? Right, yeah, cool.
Okay, we have 1 minute for the last question. So. Give it to me.
Okay, 2 minutes. Now, in many slides, you talk about mental states without indexing them to a certain subject.
Yeah.
And I would like to appeal to the history of philosophy to understand better your position. I want to make a difference between human and Kantian, no? And the self in humans, is just a bundle of mental states.
Yeah.
And in the case of Kant, it's a container where you put the states. It seems to me that you are a human, don't you?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, it's simple sort of, it's like,
Okay.
yeah, I think I have this Jungian tendencies towards it. In some, I've had conversations after presenting this with other Kantians where we've tried to actually hash out what amount of disagreement there is. And sometimes it seems like ultimately there's not a huge amount of disagreement because we're understanding the self or the subject in somewhat different ways.
Yeah.
Right? So there might still be some sort of container
Okay.
there that you could.
You would accept that there is.
Yeah, there could be some sort of container there that you say is the self, right? But in a sense, there's a lot of work that's happening within that container
Yeah.
that accounts for the unity of consciousness,
Yeah.
right? And that's this temporal work here.
Okay.
And there's going to be cases, and I didn't talk about this, there's cases where unity seems to break down that aren't split brain cases. These are people who undergo like significant psychedelic experiences, they have ego dissolution, they describe their experiences being fragmented in certain ways. You have other sorts of individuals or populations that describe experiences being disunified in ways. They're still conscious, right? And there's something interesting, these cases all involve populations that also have deficits in temporal perception capacities. They go hand in hand. There's a correlation between deficits of unity and deficits of the specific timekeeping capacities I'm talking about. Right? And that's the sort of work that would be happening within this container.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.